You are dead. Not dramatically, not heroically. You simply stopped breathing sometime in the night, and now you are moving downward, through the dark, through the cold, through the kind of silence that has no bottom. You pass through a gate, they take something from you. You don't know what. You pass through another gate, they take something else. By the time you reach the end, you can't remember what you used to be. And the worst part, the part that separates this from every nightmare you've ever had, is that nobody here is punishing you. Nobody is even watching. You are simply filed away, like dust. Like everyone else, this is not a story someone invented to scare children. This is what the oldest civilization on Earth actually believed happens when you die. The Sumerians, they were here before Greece, before Rome, before the pyramids were anything more than flat desert. They built cities when the rest of the world was still moving in small, cold groups across open land. They invented writing, not to tell stories at first, but to count grain, to track debts, to record who owed what to whom. Practical people, precise people, people who looked at the world and wanted to understand exactly how it worked, down to the last detail. And when they turned that same precise gaze toward death, what they saw did not comfort them. It did not offer justice. It did not promise anything. It simply described what was there: cold, dark, quiet, and permanent. They called it Kur. Sometimes they called it Irkala, after its queen. Sometimes Kurnugia, which translates with a kind of brutal simplicity as the land of no return. Not the land of punishment, not the land of shadows or suffering, just the place you go and don't come back from. A name that tells you everything you need to know and gives you nothing to hold on to. Picture it the way they described it. Not flames, not ice, not vast cavernous halls with dramatic lighting and the smell of sulfur. Picture a cave, a very large, very dark, very cold cave, deep beneath the earth, beneath the rivers, beneath the roots of everything you have ever known. The air does not move. The light does not reach. There are no windows, because there is nothing outside to look at. There is no sky, because sky belongs to the living. Down here, there is only stone and silence, and the soft, constant presence of dust settling on everything, including you. The dead eat dust here. That is not a metaphor. That is what the tablets say. The food of the underworld is dust and clay. The water is dirty. There are no feasts, no gardens, no fields of golden light, where the righteous walk without shoes. There is no righteous here. There is no category for righteous. You arrive, and you are given what everyone is given, which is almost nothing, and you stay. Now here is the thing that makes Kur different from every other underworld ever imagined by any culture anywhere on Earth. There is no judgment, no scales, no weighing of the heart, no list of sins read aloud in front of a court of gods, no river you have to pay to cross, where at least someone is keeping track of who you are and where you came from. In Kur, nobody asks, nobody sorts, nobody separates the good from the terrible, the gentle from the cruel, the person who spent their entire life trying from the person who spent their entire life taking. You all go to the same place. You all get the same dust. A king who built temples and fed the poor and died in his sleep at an old age, surrounded by his children. He goes to Kur, a man who burned villages and left bodies on the road and never once looked back. He also goes to Kur. They will sit in the same dust. They will breathe the same cold air. neither of them will be able to tell the difference between where they are and where the other one is, because there is no difference. The underworld doesn't grade on a curve. It doesn't grade at all. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. Every moral system humans have ever built rests on the assumption that, at some level, things balance out. Maybe not in this life. Maybe the wicked prosper and the good suffer. Maybe the world is unfair in ways that never get fixed while you're watching. But somewhere, somehow, there is a ledger. There is a final accounting. There is a place where justice catches up. This belief is so fundamental to how we function that we barely notice it anymore. It lives inside us the way breathing lives inside us. Automatic, unexamined, assumed. The Sumerians did not have this belief, and they still got up in the morning. They still planted their grain, raised their children, built their cities, wrote their poems, fell in love, grieved their dead, and stared at the night sky, wondering what all of it meant. They did all of that knowing with a clarity we rarely allow ourselves that when it ended, there would be no accounting, no recognition, no one on the other side saying, "I saw what you did. I saw who you were." It mattered. Down in Kir, the queen sits on her throne in the dark. Her name is Ereshkigal. She is not evil exactly. She is not sadistic. She does not enjoy your suffering. She simply rules the place where you are now with the same cold efficiency that a city administrator might manage a warehouse, making sure everything is in order, everything is accounted for, everything stays exactly where it was put. She has a court, she has officials. The dead move through her domain like inventory, processed, filed, forgotten. She is not cruel. That would almost be better. Cruelty implies feeling. Cruelty implies that you registered, that your presence caused some kind of reaction. Ereshkigal registers nothing. You are not interesting to her. You are not anything to her. You are simply one more shade in a realm full of shades, and the administration of her kingdom continues exactly as it did before you arrived and will continue exactly as it does after, unchanged, unmoved, permanent as stone. There is one thing Kir does not have, and its absence is the strangest detail of all. Light. Not in the dramatic sense of light representing hope or goodness or divine presence. Just literal light. Physical light, the kind your eyes need to tell the difference between one thing and another, between a face and a wall, between your hand and the dark. In Kir, you cannot see. The dead exist in a permanent, unvarying blackness. And after enough time, and time here is forever, you stop trying to remember what seeing felt like. The Sumerians weren't trying to be poetic about this. They were describing something. In their texts, the darkness of the underworld is treated as a basic fact, the way you might describe the temperature of a river or the height of a wall. It is dark down there. Everyone knows this. This is simply how it is. And somehow that flatness, that factual, unadorned acceptance of the dark, is more unsettling than any dramatic description of torment could ever be. Because torment is interesting. Torment has texture. Torment means the universe is doing something to you, which means the universe noticed you were there. The dark in Kir is not doing anything to you. It is simply there. And so are you. And that is all. But before we go deeper into what Kir was, we need to talk about what it took to get there. Because the Sumerians understood something about death that most cultures prefer not to examine too closely. They understood that dying is not a single moment. It is a process, a slow, systematic taking away. And they encoded that understanding into the most striking piece of mythology they ever produced. A story that is, depending on how you read it, either the oldest descent narrative on Earth or the oldest description of what it feels like to lose yourself completely. The goddess Inanna decided to go to the underworld. Why she decided this depends on which version of the text you're reading, and the tablets are old enough and fragmentary enough that scholars still argue about it. Some say she went to attend the funeral of her sister's husband. Some say she went out of ambition, wanting to extend her power into the realm of the dead. Some say she simply went because she was Inanna, and Inanna did not accept the existence of places she was not allowed to go. What matters is not why she went. What matters is what happened at the gates. There were 7 of them. 7 gates between the world of the living and the deepest dark of Ker. And at each gate, a gatekeeper waited. And at each gate, the rule was the same. You do not pass through as you are, you leave something behind. At the first gate, they took her crown, Inanna, goddess of love and war, the most powerful female deity in the Sumerian pantheon, the one they prayed to for harvests and victories and the survival of cities, stood at the first gate, and they removed the crown from her head. She protested. The gatekeeper told her, "The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." She passed through. At the second gate, they took the small lapis lazuli beads from her ears. At the third gate, her necklace. At the fourth gate, the ornaments from her chest. At the fifth gate, the gold ring from her wrist. At the sixth gate, the breastplate she wore, the one called "Come, Man, Come." At the seventh gate, the last one, the one that opens into the deepest dark. They took her robe, every thread of it. She arrived in Ker naked, stripped of every marker of who she was, every symbol of her power, her identity, gone, left behind at 7 gates she could not go back through. And then her sister, Ereshkigal, looked at her, and Ereshkigal's gaze alone was enough to kill her. Inanna, a goddess, died in the underworld, and her corpse was hung on a hook on the wall like meat in a storage room, like something that had been processed and filed and was no longer anyone's concern. Let that image sit for a moment. The most radiant goddess in the Sumerian world, hung on a hook in the dark, not tortured, not judged, just stored, put away, made into an object, because that is what you become in Ker. You stop being a person with a story and become a thing that takes up space. The story doesn't end there. Inanna eventually gets out through a complicated series of negotiations and sacrifices that we'll come back to. But the descent itself is the part that matters here. Because what the Sumerians were describing through her journey wasn't just a myth about a goddess. They were describing what they believe death does to every single one of us. It takes things, one by one, layer by layer. Everything you used to identify yourself, your status, your relationships, your accomplishments, your beauty, your strength, stripped away at the gates. And what's left when all of it is gone isn't a purified soul ready for paradise or a condemned sinner ready for punishment. What's left is just a shade, a dim, quiet, barely there remnant of someone who used to be a person. This is not metaphor. This is doctrine. This is what they believed. And knowing this, they were terrified of one specific thing: not dying. Dying was inevitable. and the Sumerians were practical enough to accept inevitability. What terrified them was what happened to the shade after it arrived, because it turned out that even in Ker, there was a hierarchy of suffering. If you died and your family buried you properly with the right rituals, the right offerings, the right prayers spoken over your body, your shade, your Giddim, would settle into the underworld with something close to peace, or at least with something close to the grim, dusty stability that passed for peace in Ker. You would receive the basic provisions. You would exist in the dark without too much additional suffering. You would be, in the most minimal sense of the word, maintained. But if you died without proper burial, if your body was left on a battlefield, if your family couldn't afford the rites, if you were a stranger far from home, if you were simply forgotten, then something else happened. Your shade became an Edimu. The Edimu were the restless dead, the unmaintained ones, the ones nobody fed, nobody remembered, nobody poured water for. And they did not stay quietly in the dark. They couldn't. Hunger drove them upward, back toward the world of the living, because the living had what the dead needed: food, water, warmth, attention, the simple acknowledgement that they had once existed. The Edimu came back as disease, as nightmares, as the specific, sourceless dread you feel at 3 a.m. when everything is quiet and something seems wrong but you can't say what. The Sumerians took that feeling seriously. They understood it as the presence of someone who had been forgotten, pushing against the boundary between their world and yours, trying to be remembered, trying to matter. Even now, even in this, think about the particular terror of that belief. It is not the fear of hell. It is not the fear of punishment. It is the fear that if the people who knew you failed to maintain the memory of you, if they stop saying your name, stop leaving offerings, stop treating your absence as something that requires ongoing attention, then you will dissolve. Not peacefully, not into light or rest or nothingness. You will dissolve into hunger and cold and a kind of desperate, aching, almost existence that is worse than either life or death. The Sumerians were, in other words, afraid of being forgotten. Not in the abstract way we sometimes talk about wanting to leave a legacy, wanting to be remembered for something we built or made or said. This was more immediate, more physical, more urgent than that. Forgetting was not a sentimental loss. Forgetting was a mechanism of destruction. To be forgotten was to be unmade, to have your shade wander without anchor, without food, without even the basic dignity of being a named presence in the dark. This is why they wrote things down. You may have learned at some point that writing was invented in Mesopotamia and that the earliest tablets are mostly administrative records, lists of grain, counts of livestock, records of trade. And that's true. But there is another tradition running alongside those administrative records from almost the very beginning, and it is the tradition of writing down names, of carving identity into clay so that it cannot be taken by time the way everything else is taken. They knew what erasure looked like. They had a theology of it, and they pushed back against it the only way they could, with marks on clay, with rituals, with the offering of water and bread to the dead on appointed days, with the deliberate, careful act of saying, this person was here, this person had a name, this person mattered to someone, and I am that someone, and I am still saying so, which tells you something important about who the Sumerians actually were. They were not nihilists. They did not look at the cold indifference of Ker and shrug. They looked at it, and they responded with the most human thing possible, with insistence, with the refusal to let the people they loved become Edimu, with the stubborn, almost defiant act of remembering. But even that fierce insistence on memory had limits, because there was one place where the darkness of Ker became most visible. One text where a real person, not a goddess, not a mythological figure, but a man with a life and a name, descended into the underworld and described, in plain language, exactly what he found. His name was Enkidu, and his account of what lies beneath is the oldest eyewitness report of the afterlife ever written down. Enkidu was not a god. That is the first thing to understand about him. He was made from clay and wild grass, shaped by the gods to be a companion for Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. He had lived in the open country with animals before he knew what a city was. He had been wild and warm and fully alive in the way that only someone who has never thought about death can be fully alive. And then he met Gilgamesh, and they became friends in the deep, rare way that makes the loss of a person feel like the removal of something internal. Not grief, exactly, but amputation. Enkidu, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest long narrative poem ever found, the oldest story with characters and plot and emotional consequence that we have any record of, is largely about what happened to Gilgamesh after that, how he could not accept it, how he went looking for a way to undo it, how he failed. But before all of that, in a section of the epic that many people don't know exists, Enkidu's shade was summoned back to the surface. Gilgamesh had lost something in the underworld, some objects that had fallen through a crack in the earth, and he called on the gods to let Enkidu come back long enough to tell him what it was like down there. The gods agreed. A hole opened in the earth, and Enkidu came up through it like smoke, like breath, like something that barely held together in the air. They embraced. Gilgamesh asked him, "Tell me what you saw. Tell me what it is. Tell me what is down there." And Enkidu told him, not with horror, not with dramatic revelation. He spoke with the flat, tired precision of someone describing a place they have been living in for a while and have had time to understand with terrible clarity. He said, "The place I saw, if I tell you the order of it, you will sit down and weep." He said, "My body, which you touched, and which delighted your heart, it is eaten by lice now, like an old garment." He said, "It is filled with dust. The dust is everywhere." And then Gilgamesh, still hoping, asked him, "But the man who died in battle, is he there? What is it like for him?" And Enkidu said, "His father holds his head. His wife weeps. He is at rest." Gilgamesh asked, "And the man who was never buried properly? The one left on the open ground?" Enkidu's answer was quiet and terrible. His shade finds no rest in the underworld. He roams the earth, eating scraps and drinking from gutters. Gilgamesh asked about a man with one son, with two sons. Each time, Enkidu's answer shifted slightly. More sons meant more offerings, more water poured, more bread left at the threshold, more of that fragile thread of memory holding the shade together in the dark. A man with 7 sons sat almost as comfortably as a lesser god, because 7 sons meant he would never be forgotten, not for a long time anyway, not while any of them were still breathing. And then Gilgamesh asked about a man with no sons at all, no family, no one to remember him. Enkidu said, "He eats bread baked in the ashes. He drinks water from the cracks in the wall. That is all. No elaboration, no dramatic suffering. Just the loneliest possible provision in the darkest possible place, with no one bringing anything better and no reason to expect that will ever change. Read that exchange slowly, and you will feel something shift in your chest. Because what Enkidu is describing is not torment. It is not divine justice or cosmic punishment. It is simply the arithmetic of being remembered. Your well-being in the underworld is exactly proportional to how many living people still think about you. Every person who lights an offering, pours a cup, speaks your name, adds something to your existence in Ker, and every person who forgets you removes something, until eventually, if all of them are gone, you are down to bread baked in ashes and water from the cracks. The Sumerians invented a theology of loneliness. That is what Enkidu's account amounts to. Not sin and redemption, not virtue rewarded. Just, did anyone remember you, and for how long, and how much did they care? There is a reason this text has survived 4,000 years. It didn't survive because scholars decided it was important. It survived because someone in ancient Mesopotamia carved it into clay carefully enough that it didn't dissolve when the library burned. It survived by accident and by the specific material properties of fired clay. And it lands now, in the 21st century, with the same weight it must have carried the first time it was read aloud in a room lit by oil lamps, because it is describing something that has not changed. The fear it names is not historical. It is not specific to any culture or belief system. It is the fear that lives at the center of every person who has ever wondered what trace they will leave behind. Now, step back from Enkidu for a moment. Step all the way back until you can see the whole landscape of human belief about death spread out in front of you. Because here is the thing about the Sumerian vision of the afterlife that becomes most striking when you put it in context. Every other major culture looked at death and tried to give it meaning, and the Sumerians, the oldest of all of them, looked at death and described what they actually thought they saw. The Egyptians built an entire civilization around the idea that death was a test you could pass. They spent their lives preparing for it. They memorized spells, built tombs, hired priests, wrapped their bodies in linen, placed their organs in jars, and submitted their hearts to the scales of Anubis, where a feather would determine whether they had been good enough. The heart had to be light, lighter than a feather, to earn entry into Haru, the field of reeds, where the grain was always tall and the river was always full, and the dead lived in permanent, comfortable harvest. A heavy heart was fed to Ammit and ceased to exist. This system terrified people, certainly, but notice what it also did. It made your life meaningful all the way to the end. Every act of kindness was weight removed from the heart. Every cruelty was weight added. The scales kept track even when no one was watching. The scales always knew. The Greeks divided the dead more elaborately still. Tartarus for the genuinely evil, the Titans, the great mythological criminals, the few who had personally offended the gods badly enough to earn specific, creative punishments. Sisyphus rolling his boulder, Tantalus reaching for fruit that always retreated, Elysium for heroes, and the favored, where the light was golden and the dead were at peace. The asphodel meadows for everyone else. A gray, forgettable middle ground, yes, but still a category, still a sorting, still a system that acknowledged different qualities of life and assigned different qualities of death accordingly. The Norse had Valhalla, glorious, violent, specifically reserved for warriors who died well in battle. A paradise built entirely around the idea that how you died was the most important fact about you, that the manner of your death was a reflection of the depth of your life. Cowards got Helheim. Heroes got the Hall. The universe was watching, and it had opinions. And then there is Kerr. No test, no sorting, no opinions, no hall, and no field, and no creative punishment calibrated to your specific crimes. Just gates and taking and dust and the dark, and Ereshkigal on her throne administering the whole silent machinery of it without passion or preference. Here is what is strange about all of those other systems. When you look at them from the Sumerian angle, they are all, in one way or another, extensions of justice. They are all afterlives that work the way we wish the living world would work, but usually doesn't. The good rewarded, the evil punished. A final reckoning that corrects all the unfairness you saw in your lifetime. They are consolation myths, beautiful, elaborate, emotionally necessary consolation myths. They exist because human beings need the world to make sense, and the world, as experienced day to day, often doesn't. The Sumerian underworld is not a consolation myth. It is not trying to make you feel better. It is not trying to make anything make sense. It simply describes a place that doesn't care about you, presided over by a queen who doesn't hate you but also doesn't know you exist, full of shades who all received the same inheritance. Nothing equally distributed. And the question that follows from that, the question that sits in the dark of Kerr like something breathing, is whether the Sumerians were wrong. Not theologically, not religiously, just were they wrong as observers? Because look at what they were actually describing. A universe that does not balance accounts. A world in which good and evil do not receive commensurate returns. A death that does not know your name. A silence after the last breath that does not break into light or fire or judgment or welcome. They were describing with extraordinary honesty the possibility that the universe is not a moral system, that it is a physical one, that it grinds forward the way water moves through a cave, without preference, without memory, without stopping to note who was in the way. Most cultures could not bear to look at that possibility directly. They looked slightly to the side of it and built something beautiful in the space between. The Sumerians looked directly at it, and then they did something even more extraordinary. They lived anyway, not despite the darkness of what they believed, but somehow alongside it fully, with wine and music and the building of cities and the writing of love poems and the planting of gardens in the desert. They held the knowledge of Kerr in one hand and the warmth of the present moment in the other. And they chose, not out of ignorance, not out of denial, but out of something that looks a great deal like courage, to press toward the warmth. There is a woman in the Epic of Gilgamesh named Siduri. She runs a tavern at the edge of the world, at the boundary between the known and the unknowable. Gilgamesh comes to her half mad with grief after Enkidu's death, still searching for immortality, still refusing to accept what he knows is true. And Siduri looks at him with the calm directness of someone who has thought about this for a very long time and says words that are, depending on your tolerance for ancient philosophy, either very comforting or very devastating. She says, when the gods created humanity, they assigned death to humanity. Life they kept for themselves. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, make merry day and night of each day, make a feast of rejoicing, day and night, dance and play. Look at the child who holds your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These things alone are the concerns of humanity. 4,000 years ago, at the edge of the world, in a text pressed into clay by someone whose name we don't know, these things alone are the concerns of humanity, not the accumulation of power, not the building of monuments that outlast you, not the solving of death or the bargaining with gods for more time. The child's hand, the wife's warmth, the food on the table and the music in the evening, and the full awareness held alongside the grief of knowing it ends, that right now, in this specific unrepeatable moment, you are alive. Sit with that for a moment, because there is something almost unbearable about the clarity of it. Siduri is not offering hope. She is not telling Gilgamesh that it gets better, that death is not what it seems, that Enkidu is somewhere warm and well-fed waiting for him. She knows what death is. She lives at its border. She has probably watched more people walk past her tavern toward the darkness than she can count, and she offers him not consolation, but precision. She tells him exactly where the value is, now that the illusions have been stripped away. This is what the Sumerians understood that we keep having to relearn, that knowing the worst does not make life smaller. It makes the present, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we arrive at what the Sumerians did with the darkness, we need to sit in the darkness itself a little longer. We need to understand fully why Kur disturbs us in a way that other underworlds don't. Why the absence of fire is more unsettling than the fire itself. Why a cold cave full of dust gets under the skin in a way that Dante's Inferno, with all its circles and inventive torments, somehow doesn't. And the answer has to do with something very specific about how the human mind processes fear. We are afraid of pain. That is obvious. But we are more afraid of meaninglessness. Pain, at some level, is information. It tells you something is wrong. It asks you to respond. It places you in a relationship with the world, even if that relationship is hostile. Meaninglessness is not information. Meaninglessness is the absence of any relationship at all. It is the universe looking through you as though you were not there. Hell, in the Christian tradition, is terrible, but look carefully at what makes it terrible. It is not just the fire, it is the personal attention. Every torment in hell is in some sense customized. Dante's sinners are punished in ways that mirror their sins. The lustful blown on endless winds, the violent submerged in rivers of blood. Each punishment is a kind of dark commentary on who the person was and what they did. Each sinner is recognized. The universe studied them carefully enough to craft something specific for them. Even the devil knows their name. That is not a cold universe. That is an intensely interested universe. A universe that cares, even if what it feels toward you is something like contempt. Kur cares about no one. There is a word for what Kur represents, and it is not evil. It is not malevolence. The word is indifference. Pure, structural, cosmological indifference. The kind that has no face and no intention and no possibility of being argued with or appealed to or outlasted. You cannot earn your way out of Kur's indifference. You cannot pray it into paying attention. You cannot be good enough or powerful enough or beloved enough to make the darkness notice you specifically. Even Inanna, remember Inanna, even she could not simply override it. She had to negotiate. She had to sacrifice someone else in her place. The rules of Kur did not bend for a goddess. The rules of Kur do not bend for anyone. because the rules of Kerr are not rules in the sense of laws that someone made and someone enforces. They are facts. The way gravity is a fact. The way the dark at the bottom of the ocean is a fact. They simply are, and you simply arrive in them, and that is the entire story. And this is the thing about indifference that is harder to bear than cruelty. You cannot hate it back. When something is cruel to you, you can feel righteous anger. You can resist. You can tell the story of your resistance and be the hero of it. The cruelty of the villain makes you, by contrast, a person worth noticing. But what do you do with a force that simply doesn't see you? What story do you tell about an absence that has no face? How do you resist something that isn't even aware you're trying? The Sumerians pressed their fingers into clay and tried to answer that question over and over again in myths and laments and love poems and administrative records and royal hymns. They produced, over the course of several thousand years, one of the most voluminous literary traditions in the ancient world, and almost all of it is, underneath the surface detail, about the same thing, about what it means to be a conscious creature in a universe that is not conscious back, about what to do with that knowledge, about how to live inside it without being destroyed by it. And here is what they found. It is not a comfortable answer, but it is an honest one. They found that meaning is not given. It is made, not by the gods, not by the structure of the universe, not by some cosmic accountant keeping track of your moral ledger. It is made by you, in the specific circumstances of your specific life, in the hours and days and years you have before the gates appear and the taking begins. It is made in the grain you plant and the bread you bake and the person sleeping next to you and the child whose hand you hold and the friend you grieve with a grief so overwhelming that it sends you to the end of the world looking for a way to undo death itself. Gilgamesh could not save Enkidu. He searched the entire known world. He crossed the waters of death. He found Utnapishtim, the one man who had been granted immortality, and begged him for the secret. Utnapishtim told him, "There is a plant at the bottom of the ocean that restores youth." Gilgamesh dove to the bottom of the ocean and found it. He held immortality in his hands, and then a snake stole it while he was sleeping. He woke up and the plant was gone and the snake was disappearing into the grass, already shedding its skin, which is why snakes shed their skin, the Sumerians explained, while humans do not. The snake got the plant, we got death. Gilgamesh sat by the water and wept, and then he went home, back to Uruk, the city he had built, back to the walls he had raised. He walked the length of those walls, and the text describes him looking at them. The baked brick, the fired clay, the craftsmanship of it, with the particular attention of someone who has just stopped trying to escape and started actually looking at where they are. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends not with triumph, not with the conquest of death, not with any of the things he had been chasing. It ends with a man looking at the walls of his city and understanding for the first time that this specific, mortal, limited, already ending thing is what there is, and that it is somehow enough. Not because it will last. Nothing lasts. Not because it will be remembered. Memory is fragile, and the clay tablets that preserved Gilgamesh's name were buried under rubble for 2,000 years. Not because the universe is watching. The universe is not watching. It never was. But because it is here. Right now. The wall is real. The city is real. The grief was real. The friendship was real. Enkidu was real. And he lived, and Gilgamesh knew him. And that knowing happened. And nothing not Kerr, not dust, not the indifference of the cosmos can unhappen it. The Sumerians understood something that we dress up in philosophy and self-help and therapy and religion, and still, after all that dressing, find impossible to fully hold that the present moment is the only place where any of this is real. Not the afterlife, not the legacy, not the monument or the name carved in stone. The moment when the fire is lit and the food is warm and someone you love is in the same room, breathing. This is what made their relationship with Kerr bearable. Not denial of it, not the invention of a more comforting afterlife to replace it, but the clear-eyed, daily, deliberate choice to be here, in the light, while there is still light to be in. They had rituals for this, regular festivals where the dead were formally acknowledged, water poured, bread placed at the threshold, names spoken aloud, not out of sentimentality, out of understanding. The dead needed the living to remember them, and the living needed the dead to remind them of what they had. Each ceremony was both an act of love toward the gone and an act of attention toward what remained. A structured practice of presence, a reminder built into the calendar that every person breathing at the table was already in the arithmetic of time, halfway to the dust. They did not look away from that. They set a place at the feast for it. And this is the thing, the final, strange, unsettling thing about the Sumerian vision of death that stays with you after everything else fades. It is not pessimistic. It presents itself as pessimistic. It looks, at first glance, like the bleakest theology ever constructed by human hands. No heaven, no judgment, no reward, no light. Just dust and dark and the cold administrative efficiency of Ereshkigal underthrown. But underneath that bleakness is something that functions, if you press it, almost like grace. Because a universe that does not grade you is also a universe that does not condemn you. A death that does not judge your life is also a death that does not reduce your life to a verdict. Everything you did, everything you felt, every grief you carried, every moment of strange, unexpected beauty that crossed your path on an ordinary afternoon, none of it is reducible to a final score. None of it is trivialized by being weighed against a cosmic standard you didn't set and couldn't fully know. It just was. It happened. It was real in the way that only real things are real. And then it ended the way all real things end. There is something in that, something underneath the fear of it, that is almost a relief. Almost a relief. Hold that thought, because it will feel strange for a moment before it feels true. We live in a world absolutely saturated with judgment. Not just religious judgment, the cosmic ledger, the final accounting, but the smaller daily kind, the constant invisible audit of whether you are doing enough, being enough, behind, whether your choices were correct, whether your life, when measured against some standard you absorbed without fully choosing it, will turn out to have been worth the space it took up. We carry this audit with us everywhere. It follows us into the morning and sits with us at night, and is often, if we are honest, the thing that makes sleep difficult. The Sumerians did not have heaven, but they also did not have this particular form of torment. The torment of the provisional self. The self that is always under review, always one bad decision away from a revised verdict, always performing for an audience that may or may not exist. In their cosmology, the verdict was already in. Not cruel, not kind, just settled. You would go to Kerr. Everyone would go to Kerr. The question was never whether you were good enough to avoid it, The question was only what you would do with the time before it. And that question, freed from the anxiety of cosmic evaluation, becomes something different. It becomes almost spacious. What do you actually want to do with the fire while it burns? Not what should you do, not what will look correct in the final accounting. What do you want? What matters to you specifically in the small and irreplaceable life that is yours and no one else's? This is what Siduri understood at her tavern at the edge of the world. She had watched enough people walk past her toward the dark to know what they regretted. And it was never the monuments they hadn't built. It was never the wars they hadn't won, or the wealth they hadn't accumulated, or the posterity they hadn't secured. It was smaller than that. It was always smaller than that. The hand they hadn't held, the evening they had been too preoccupied to notice, the meal eaten quickly, distracted, when they could have tasted it. She told Gilgamesh, "Let your belly be full. Dance and play. Look at the child who holds your hand." These things alone are the concerns of humanity. She was not being dismissive. She was being precise. She had done the calculation and arrived at an answer, and she was giving it to him straight, the way you give something to a person you respect enough not to lie to. The concerns of humanity, not the concerns of gods who live forever and can afford to be patient. Not the concerns of heroes who will be sung about in texts that endure. The concerns of humanity, which is to say, of creatures who are finite, who know they are finite, who carry that knowledge in their bodies every day and still get up and light the fire and begin again. Begin again. That phrase is worth pausing on, because in the Sumerian worldview, the cycle of daily life, the lighting of fires, the planting of grain, the pouring of offerings, the telling of stories, was not incidental to the meaning of existence. It was the meaning of existence. There was no larger structure to appeal to. There was no bigger story in which your small life was a meaningful episode. There was only the texture of your days, pressed up close, the way you press your face close to something to really see it. They pressed close. The Sumerians wrote love poems of surprising warmth and specificity. They wrote lullabies. They wrote arguments between farmers and shepherds, between summer and winter, between the hoe and the plow, comic, lively, deeply invested in the ordinary details of who grew what and which mattered more. They wrote prayers full of the kind of raw, unglamorous desperation that makes you realize these were not people performing piety, but people genuinely frightened and genuinely hoping. They wrote a poem called "The Dialogue of a Man with His God," one of the oldest expressions of the problem of suffering ever put into words, in which a man who has done everything right, prayed every prayer, made every offering, still finds himself sick and poor and abandoned. He does not understand why. He asks his God directly. He says, "I did not know that I had done wrong. The transgression I committed, I do not know it." This is not a comfortable poem. It does not resolve the way you want it to. The God eventually restores the man, but the text is less interested in the restoration than in the crisis, in the raw, honest confrontation with a universe that does not always correlate cause and effect, goodness and outcome. Prayer and answer. They knew. They had always known. The universe they described was not a just one. Ker was the proof and the symbol of that. The great equalizer, the final indifferent room where justice never arrived because justice was not the architecture of things. And they kept living. They kept writing. They kept pressing marks into clay, making grain into bread, building ziggurats toward a sky that did not answer. loving people who would die, grieving people who were already gone, speaking the names of the dead so that the dead might have water in the dark. There is a particular quality to this persistence. It is not hope in the conventional sense, not the belief that things will get better, that the universe will eventually come around, that the ledger will one day balance. It is something tougher and quieter than hope. It is the decision to participate fully in a life that you know is bounded, in a world that you know is indifferent, not because you have found a reason that makes the indifference acceptable, but because the life itself, the actual lived texture of it, the warmth and the grief and the absurd comedy of arguing about whether the hoe is better than the plow is worth participating in, fully, right up until the gates. Worth participating in not because of what it leads to, worth participating in because of what it is. This is the thought the Sumerians left us, pressed into clay, buried under rubble, lost for 2,000 years, dug up by archaeologists who were mostly looking for something else, translated by scholars arguing over the meaning of words that no one has spoken aloud in millennia. This is what survived all of that and arrived here in this century, in your ears, in the dark. The thought is this: there is no light at the end. There is only the light while you are in it. And that changes everything about how you hold the light. Think about what you looked at today, the ordinary details, the color of the sky through whatever window was nearest, the temperature of the first drink you took in the morning, the specific quality of the silence in the room before anyone else woke up. You almost certainly did not notice these things. You were thinking about what came next, about what you had forgotten, about the audit running quietly in the background of your consciousness, checking, calculating, comparing. The Sumerians were not more enlightened than us. They were frightened in ways we are not frightened, burdened by superstitions and uncertainties that we have, largely, though never entirely, resolved. Their world was harder than ours in almost every physical sense. Cold and disease and famine and violence were closer to them, more immediate, less preventable. But they understood, with a directness that we keep losing and having to rediscover, that the moment you are in is the moment you have, that the fire in front of you is a real fire, that the person sleeping near you is a real person, that the bread you are eating came from grain that someone planted in actual earth, and that the eating of it is not a pause between important things, but is itself an important thing, maybe, when stripped of everything else, the most important thing there is. Down in Kur, Ereshkigal sits in the dark. The administration of the dead continues without urgency or passion. The shades move through the dust. The gates stand closed behind them. 7 of them, heavy, final, and at each one, something was taken that cannot be returned. But that is not where you are. You are here. In the dark, that is a different kind of dark. The warm, breathing dark of a room where things are alive, where sounds continue, where morning will eventually come through a window and light whatever is there to be lit. You are in the place the Sumerians pointed at when they said, "This, here, now, this is what you have been given." Not the eternity that doesn't exist, not the justice that isn't coming, not the judgment you keep preparing for. This, the particular weight of your body, the specific temperature of the air, the way your mind moves when it isn't being asked to perform or produce or justify, the strange, recurring miracle of being conscious in a universe that is mostly not, as far as anyone can tell, conscious at all. The Sumerians wrote their myths and their laments and their love poems and their administrative records and pressed them all into clay and put them in their libraries. Most of those libraries burned. The clay survived the fire because that is what clay does. It hardens under heat rather than dissolving into it. The words were buried. The civilization that made them stopped, the way all civilizations stop, not dramatically, but through the slow accumulation of change and pressure and time. And then, out of the rubble, the words came back. Gilgamesh came back. Inanna came back. Enkidu's voice came back from under the earth, the way it does in the story, rising like smoke, like breath, like something that barely holds together in the air, telling us what it is like down there, telling us what Ker looks like, giving us with the flat, honest precision of the dead the thing we need to hear. It is cold, it is dark, it is dust, and you are not there yet. You are here, still breathing, still warm, still on the right side of the 7 gates, still in possession of everything that will, eventually, be taken. The crown and the earrings and the necklace and the robe, the name that someone still speaks, the body that still holds its heat, the mind that is still, right now, even now, doing the extraordinary, unremarkable, irreplaceable thing it does. Moving through the dark, awake, present, alive. The oldest story ever written ends with a man looking at the walls he built and understanding that this is enough, not because he found a reason that makes death acceptable, but because the walls are real, and the city is real, and the evening is real, and he is standing in it. And for now, for right now, that is the whole of what there is, and the whole of what there needs to be. Let that be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. Not the fear of Ker, not the cold of it, the dust of it, the silence of it, but the strange, ancient, still living thought that came out of the oldest civilization on Earth and crossed 4,000 years of rubble, and, forgetting to land here, in this room, in the dark, that is your dark, and no one else's. You are still in the light. Notice it.